Andrew, thanks very much indeed for joining us. And obviously, part of what we're going to be discussing is this new era, post-COVID. One of the things that the West has been focusing on, really coincident with the pandemic, is our dependence on China. I know we have a number of other speakers discussing this, but you sent me an article which was written by your CEO, and I found it very intriguing. And he used an analogy of high fructose corn syrup, that insidious ingredient that makes its way into absolutely everything in the US in particular. And as one of the ingredients that has been identified as a potential cause of obesity in the United States. In what way is high fructose corn syrup related to the datacomms industry?
Yeah, it's a bit of a strange analogy, I'll admit, but when you look and delve down into how the US ended up with corn syrup in everything almost, throughout the food chain, it's so pervasive. What you actually uncover is a whole series of political decisions that were made back in the 70s and 80s. Things like subsidies. It actually goes back to the production of ethanol and the kind of the oil crisis. But then that kind of that oil crisis was resolved. But now you had this oversupply of corn, and syrup is the byproduct of ethanol. And what you ended up with is effectively a hugely subsidized product, which became incredibly attractive for everybody to find a use for. And market forces obviously then dictated that corn syrup ended up in everything. And when you think about what's happened with Chinese manufacturing, and in fact, just not even just in technology, just the way in which China in particular has incented their own industries and subsidized their own industries, market forces then have meant that Chinese manufactured goods have kind of made their way into every part of our supply chain. And I think it's important that we kind of we kind of acknowledge that this isn't really, for us at least, it's not really about trying to demonize China. They made some decisions to become a world leader in manufacturing, and they subsidized it, and then market forces took over, and we all jumped on that bandwagon. We all became addicted to the cheap tech. And that's, at one level, that's just market forces taking over. The real point for us is what it really exposes is issues in our supply chain, and the opaque nature by which we're now adopting, especially technology, and building it into products far and wide. But for us, it's a little bit of a red herring to start singling out a few brands and thinking that basically is going to solve the problem, because the reality, when you look at the supply chain for technology products, there's a lot of opacity within there. Lots of chunks of technology, sub-assemblies, if you like, both of software and of hardware, where nobody really can tell you for sure what's inside them, because the way in which they're delivered means there's no way of looking inside them fundamentally. Yeah. So without that transparency, you are going to get into situations, regardless of the brand that's on the front of the box, where you've got this potential challenge, because there's no way of transparency in there.
Yeah, and it's of course pervading all aspects of the technology industry as well. It's not just Huawei and the 5G debate, and obviously the critical importance of integrity in terms of hardware components in the 5G network, and also in terms of the relationship between, say, the US and the UK, for example. But it's also about the degree of involvement in in consumer applications as well. We've seen a big debate around TikTok, for example, and their announcement recently that they're going to be opening a new data center in Ireland has caused a lot of debate. Do you think we're seeing the opening of a new Cold War, though, particularly between the US and China over tech, or do we need to kind of delineate between where there is potential interference from the Chinese Communist Party and products that are relatively innocuous?
to answer your first part, I'm not sure. That's not really in my purview to think about the Cold War. What I will say is this: if you think about how pervasive technology is in terms of where it's built and how it's built today, you can't just disassociate yourself from Chinese manufacture or Chinese tech. It just, practically speaking, that won't happen. It certainly won't happen overnight, and probably wouldn't happen for decades to really separate those two things. And I'm not sure, in truth, that really solves the problem, because the reality is that it almost doesn't matter where products are built. It doesn't necessarily matter where the technology is coming from. The challenge is this opacity, the lack of ability to transparently understand what it is you're buying or installing, and so on. So to maybe take a step back and understand how products are built these days. So I'm going to talk about hardware rather than apps and software, because that's kind of the world that we at SoftIron are kind of part of. So if you look at the vast majority of tech and how it's built, you've got all of these sub-assemblies that can come from different parts of the world. You buy chips with pre-compiled code. You can't see what's inside the code necessarily. Those products are, for the most part, manufactured in subcontract manufacture. A lot of it in China, in truth. But again, the same manufacturers, a relatively small number, will be manufacturing for dozens of different brands, the big high street brands. And so you end up with this situation where nobody, even the brands themselves, can tell you for sure what's inside their products fundamentally. And without that, you never get to this transparency and can never really be sure what's inside the product. So that's really the challenge, and it's the supply chain challenge fundamentally. It almost doesn't matter if the factory was in China or was in any other part of the world. If that design can be subverted in some way, it could be manufactured anywhere potentially, and without that transparency, you can't tell.
And is it going to be possible, however, to manufacture products if there is that sort of absolute interdependency in terms of the componentry? Companies like yours, have you taken the decision to manufacture entirely in the US, or including all of the subcomponents, or is there likely to be a sort of critical mass of components that, because of the development of IP or surface mount technologies or whatever it might be, can only be manufactured in some particular regions? To what extent can we wrest control back?
Yeah, and this is exactly the point, Jeff, because the reality is we're all reliant on Chinese tech. It doesn't matter if it's SoftIron or one of the biggest technology vendors on the planet. There is Chinese technology in all products. So to answer your question about what we're doing personally at SoftIron is we are actually manufacturing in the US, but that's not the crux of the difference. The crux of the difference is that the method by which we're managing our supply chain and managing our manufacturing process means that for our customers that really care about security, properly care about security, we can give them transparency into the whole chain. It comes back to this question of trust, really. Today, in all honesty, you've got to trust the vendor has done their job in securing their product, if you like, in securing their supply chain and what's inside the box. We're trying to get to a point where you don't have to trust us. As SoftIron, we explicitly say, you don't want to be in a position where you have to trust us. That's not how we solve this. What we need to do is give you the ability to audit the provenance of the product that you're buying. And for our customers who care deeply about that, we can give them that kind of auditable provenance, that transparency into everything that's inside the box that they're purchasing. And that's the way you solve it. And then it actually doesn't matter then almost, arguably, if a design has been subverted, because you're not trusting us, you're trusting your own audit, if you like, your own transparency. And that's kind of where we need to get to, I think, for especially products that are in the most sensitive of environments.
And One of your key markets is the data center market, and obviously it's exploding. We're seeing huge growth, and in order to meet the demands for like, for example, this type of thing, video conferencing and so on, there has been an explosive growth in data center service provision and capability, and also the development of mega data centers, that are literally vast enterprises with dedicated backhaul connectivity, et cetera, being developed by Facebook and Amazon and others. Yeah. Do you believe that the data center operators get this message and are actively trying to look at not just their supply chain of components, but also the components within the components?
There's something really interesting happening, and it was happening already without COVID, and it's been accelerated because of COVID, which is actually, the data centers you described, the Facebooks of the world, we call those hyperscale data centers in kind of the data center parlance. But actually what's happening at the moment is we're seeing this build out of what you might call regional data centers or edge infrastructure. And that's being driven partly by AI, partly by IoT, but now it's also being driven because many more people are outside of their core locations. And so we're seeing much more data being created, much more high value data being created outside of those hyperscale data centers than ever was happening before. And that's a huge area of growth right now. And I'd say it's kind of that combination of three different drivers driving this growth of regional data centers. And I think there's a challenge there for the data center operators, let's call them in the broadest sense, whether they're MSPs or running your own infrastructure. Because as soon as you start creating high value, or either creating or hosting high value data outside of those one or two hyperscale data centers, which are super secure, super efficient, have all of the skills and available to you, you've got a whole different challenge to solve. Data is now living in places that data didn't used to live before, and that's a different kind of security challenge. It's a different kind of management challenge. Potentially power and efficiency become really important as well, because again, I'm not in a hyperscale data center anymore. I'm building a small regional data center, and I can't necessarily guarantee access to a purpose-built, perfectly efficient environment. So I think that is absolutely being acknowledged by the guys building these kind of solutions out. And you'll see a lot of talk in the industry about edge data centers, and that's only going to accelerate now. It's something that we've been looking at as well, because that actually, our approach helps us do that very well.
And there's been a lot of talk too about critical data infrastructure as well, where high performance computing is becoming much more of a focus area, and certainly a focus area for government, and also the emergence of quantum-proof data centers as well, and there's a big focus on cybersecurity increasingly too. Do you think companies like yours are going to be more active in that sort of hyper secure environment, but perhaps for a different use case than the Amazons and Facebooks were for critical corporate data?
Well, so SoftIron is open source based, as you know. We use the Ceph storage architecture, for example, to provide storage, and that comes out of the high performance computing world. Because it's incredibly scalable, because it's very resilient, and we are now seeing a lot more applications of that kind of technology in what you might call edge scenarios. Really interesting ones. So a large defense aviation organization, let's call them, is using our technology, for example, to capture data coming back from missions, from flights, and then capturing it and bring it back into their environment. So they've got quite a high performance data center, but right out at the edge, or kind of where the planes are, effectively. And we're seeing a lot more of those kind of scenarios. We've always had a lot of customers in the kind of national laboratories and those kind of places. And of course, a big area of investment right now with all the additional research that's going on. So yeah, for sure, we're seeing the adoption of these kind of hyper resilient, hyper scalable kind of architectures, but thinking now in terms of what will scale out into these edge infrastructures as well, as opposed to just up inside a hyperscale data center.
Yeah, and I suppose the other area that is beginning to bubble is so-called Industry 4.0, and of course, the coincident with the rollout of 5G technologies. I recently had an overview of a test case manufacturing plant in the north of England, where they literally flooded the place with 5G sensors in order to create a kind of automated factory environment. Do you think that's also going to be driving some of these data center solutions?
For sure. So, apart from just the raw amount of data you're going to be creating, you actually want to, in many instances, if you like, the half-life of that data could be quite short, because we're collecting this information, we want to do something with it, and then make a decision and then move on, kind of thing. And so we are going to see, I think, more high performance compute and storage and network move further and further outside of the traditional data center. And it's absolutely, I mean, we're seeing that today. That example I just gave you is very similar, but in the manufacturing world, that was already happening anyway. But yeah, we're just going to see that accelerate at this point, I would say. Okay. And there's a real skills challenge, which we haven't really touched on, and maybe other people that you're talking to will. But data center skills are in huge shortage around the world right now for different reasons. I mean, in emerging markets, there just aren't people being trained. In some of the more mature markets, maybe like you and me, Jeff, the industry, the workforce is graying out. I mean, they're literally retiring, and there isn't a new set of staff in the wings ready to take over. And so we need to look and think about how we make these architectures, which are going to be much more distributed, much more manageable, much more resilient and scalable in a simple kind of way. And for us in the open source world, that's not open source's traditional strength, really. Its strength has been, its sophistication and its customization. But now we're seeing the shift to thinking about resilience and scale out, if you like, to a much greater degree. And we're playing, our role in all of that, because that's a key part of what we're trying to do with the kind of architecture that we're building.
Okay, so we've covered high fructose corn syrup, the Cold War, provenance, manufacturing, moving back from China and the Far East, TikTok and edge scenarios. So I think we've covered a fair amount. Andrew,
did pretty well.
Thanks as ever for taking the time to have a chat, and hopefully we can give some feedback to people who will be asking questions during this session. So I do appreciate it. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Jeff.